Good morning. How far would you go to escape from hell? What if that hell was an island in the North Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by shark-infested waters? Add to that you're innocent. What would you do to get out of there? How about if you knew someone else was locked up there? Someone else who was innocent of any crime and sentenced to life imprisonment on a remote, hot and humid island. An island so hellish, it's actually called Devil's Island. Would you do anything? Devil's Island is actually the colloquial name of 3 islands, though only one of them is actually the Devil's Island, Ile du Diable in French. Together with Ile Royale and Ile Saint-Joseph, these 3 tiny specks off the coast of French Guiana make up what are actually known as les Îles du Salut, Salvation Islands. Now, that name might sound hopeful, but don't be fooled. For the prisoners sent here by the French government between 1852 and 1953, salvation was in short supply. Disease, isolation, and brutal punishments made these islands infamous across the world. These islands, without needing to put too fine a point on it, were actually deadly. In its 101 years of operation, this prison locked up approximately 70,000 prisoners. Do you know how many of them died? Out of 70,000 inmates, 50,000 died within their sentence. That is a death rate of 70%. These islands, particularly the southernmost Ile Saint-Joseph, became infamous as a place where exile often meant slow death. As the historian Stephen Dando Collins puts it, this was less a prison than a machine for human destruction. Once sentenced to incarceration in France's penal colony here in French Guiana, you had a 3 in 10 chance of walking out alive. So if you knew someone was locked up here for a crime that they hadn't done, and you knew they weren't yet dead, what would you do to save them? And let's start by being totally blunt about the matter. Most of us would do nothing at all. We might like to think we would do something, but whether or not we like to hear it, studies show that the vast majority of us would stay deadly silent on the matter and tut our disappointment and sadness at the situation, probably over a nice steak and fries dinner. Really. Psychological studies across decades consistently show that most people do not intervene, even when they believe something is wrong. The most famous example is the bystander effect, first studied after the 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York, where numerous neighbors reportedly failed to help or call the police. Psychologist Latane and Darley demonstrated that the more people who witness an injustice, the less likely an individual is to act because they assume that someone else will. This is echoed in Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, where 65% of participants continued administering what they believed to be dangerous electric shocks to others purely because an authority figure told them to do so. Likewise, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment shows how ordinary people in certain environments will conform to roles that enable cruelty, even without personal malice. In short, most of us would rather rationalize our inaction than risk discomfort, even when we know something's wrong. Silence, not heroism, is the norm. But some people do not stay silent. Today I'm going to tell you the story of one of Devil Island's most famous inmates, an innocent man framed for treason, and the actions of a stranger back in France that gave him his life back. It's become known as the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus was born in 1859 in the town of Mulhouse in the Alsace region. Now, at the time, Alsace had just been taken over by Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. But the Dreyfus family, who were Jewish and fairly well off, chose to keep their French nationality. They saw themselves as proud French citizens, and Alfred carried that pride with him for all of his life. He was smart, serious, good with numbers, and that made him a natural fit for the military. He got into École Polytechnique, which was one of France's top military schools, and he worked his way up through the ranks. And by 1893, he'd earned a spot on the French Army's General Staff, which was an impressive achievement for anyone, but especially rare for someone who was Jewish. He was the only Jewish officer on the French General Staff. And this made him a little conspicuous and a little unpopular. By the end of the 19th century, anti-Semitism was back on the rise in Europe. Dreyfus didn't necessarily have many friends. He was known for being methodical, a little bit reserved. He wasn't exactly the life of the party, but he was loyal. He was competent, and he was committed to serving France. He surely had no idea that within a year of his appointment to the French Army's General Staff, he would go from Captain Alfred Dreyfus to a national disgrace. So what happened? In late 1894, a housekeeper at the German embassy in Paris, who was secretly working for French intelligence, found a torn-up letter in a rubbish bin. It was a handwritten memo listing sensitive military information, and it quickly became known as the bordereau. French counterintelligence suspected that it had been written by someone inside the general staff, someone who had access to confidential artillery plans. But rather than conduct a full and proper investigation, the army fixated on one name, Captain Alfred Dreyfus. Why? Well, partly because he had access to this information, but also, it must be said, because he was Jewish from Alsace, not particularly well liked by his colleagues. That was enough. Handwriting experts were brought in, but they couldn't agree. But still, the case was pushed forward with no real proof. Dreyfus was arrested, and he was charged with treason. He protested his innocence, but the wheels were already turning. In December of 1894, after a closed-door military trial, where the defense wasn't even shown all the evidence, he was found guilty. Secret documents that neither he nor his lawyers had ever seen were used to sway the judges. And these documents were later revealed to be forgeries. But by then, the damage was done. What followed was a brutal public humiliation. In a formal ceremony in the courtyard of the École Militaire, Dreyfus's uniform was ripped apart, his military insignia was torn off, his sword was broken in half, and he was paraded before a jeering crowd who were shouting, "Death to the Jew." And then he was shipped across the Atlantic to the most remote and desolate place in the French Empire, Devil's Island. There, alone on a small rocky outcrop in the Atlantic, surrounded by shark-infested waters, Captain Dreyfus was kept under constant surveillance in a small hut in unbearable tropical heat, cut off from his family and from the world. He still had no idea who had betrayed him or why no one had spoken up in his defense. And he became one of the 70,000 sent here to rot in hell. But back in France, the first stirrings of doubt were beginning to rise. And one man, far removed from the military establishment, would soon risk everything to bring the truth to light. And that man was Emile Zola, France's most famous novelist at the time, and no stranger to controversy. Zola was a literary heavyweight, best known for his gritty, unflinching portrayals of working-class life in novels like Germinal and Thérèse Raquin. He was deeply concerned with truth, justice, and the social conditions that shaped people's lives. And his work didn't shy away from poverty, corruption, or hypocrisy, and neither did he. Zola wasn't a soldier, he wasn't Jewish, he didn't know Alfred Dreyfus. In fact, he had no personal connection to the man whatsoever. But what he did have was a deep commitment to justice and a growing sense of outrage as to what he saw unfolding in his country. At first, just like most of the public, he had accepted Dreyfus's guilt. But as new evidence came to light, most importantly the realization that Major Esterhazy, not Dreyfus, was the likely author of the bordereau, Zola began to dig deeper. What disturbed him wasn't just the miscarriage of justice, it was the cover-up, the lies, the anti-Semitism at the heart of it all. Zola saw this not just as a legal case gone wrong, but as a threat to the soul of the French Republic. And once he was convinced of Dreyfus's innocence, he used the only weapon he had, his pen. I'll tell you what he wrote after we open the portal and collect our next port of call, Ile Royale in les Iles du Salut, or what we all know of as Devil's Island. So we start with our picture of the port facility. You can see that there are no facilities. It's just a floating pontoon tender platform. And this is because this is an abandoned prison facility. There are very few people who actually live on the island. I'll get into them in a moment. But by and large, it is an abandoned facility that is visited here and there by a few tourists. I'll show you on the map now where this tender platform is. So, you can see the three islands together. We're coming into the middle one. People collectively call them Devil's Island because that's the most dramatic name of the three. But Devil's Island itself, Ile du Diable, is closed. Nobody's allowed to visit. It's extremely dangerous now to go across there. Though the waters seem calm, they are not as smooth as you think, and they are shark-infested. I will get on to why they are shark-infested in a minute. But we are going to be coming in to the southernmost point of Ile Royale. From there, you can walk around the whole island roughly 2 hours. So if you were just to do a loop, you could do 2 hours. To go between places, obviously it would be less than that. The tender ride itself very, very short, about 300 meters, which is 5 minutes in the tender. All right, let's get into our top 9. L'Auberge des Iles is the only hotel on Ile Royale. It's actually the only hotel in all 3 of these islands. And it's housed in a former colonial building that was once used by the French prison staff. So the Auberge offers basic accommodation, but it's steeped in haunting history. People do stay here. Why? I have no idea. But they stay here overnight. Must be so spooky. Guests can dine at the on-site restaurant, as can you. And so if you wanted to have lunch out, then this is your one option. The restaurant's pretty simple, French Creole food with these beautiful dramatic sea views. There's also a small, somewhat expensive gift shop that sells books, souvenirs, and local crafts. So how local these local crafts are is open to debate, given that this is an abandoned prison facility and only a few space cadets live here. Though rustic, the inn's unique setting amidst this ruins of the penal colony is what makes it a memorable stop on this remote and atmospheric island. Now, one of the few remaining buildings on the island that still serves the original purpose that it was purpose-built for is the lighthouse on Ile Royale. Now, this was built in 1934 to replace an earlier structure that was destroyed by a fire, and it continues to guide ships navigating the treacherous waters off of French Guiana's coast. It's a 17-meter tower that rises above the island's highest point, offering those sweeping views of the surrounding sea. And while the rest of the island tells stories of captivity and decay, the lighthouse stands as a quiet symbol of endurance. Its beams still flashing across the Atlantic, still saving lives, just as it did nearly a century ago. Just whilst I'm on this slide, I want to point out that I have put orange for all of the accessibility symbols for this presentation because There is a path that you can go on. It's not particularly smooth, and so it really depends on how bumpy you want to take it. There are stairs as well, and obviously stairs are not accessible, but the longer path makes a winding route to pretty much everywhere that I'm talking about. I'm just not saying it's a comfortable path. The Musée de Bain is located here on the island, offering a sober look into the brutal legacy of the French penal colonies here. It's housed in one of the former administrative buildings, and the museum presents photographs, artifacts, personal accounts that chronicle the daily life and the harsh conditions experienced by prisoners here. Displays include shackles, former prisoner uniforms, tools, and then panels detailing infamous inmates like Captain Dreyfus. It's small, but the museum powerfully conveys the cruelty and isolation of life on these islands. And it is a must-see. It's a must-visit for those of you seeking to understand the human cost behind this now hauntingly beautiful historic site. And it's free to go inside. Now, the prison chapel is one of the island's most atmospheric remnants. It's a crumbling symbol of faith amid despair. And it was built in 1855 for the prison guards and the administrators, not the convicts. It offered a rare sanctuary here in an otherwise brutal environment. But most remarkable are the faded religious murals inside. They were painted between 1938 and 1941 by Francis Lagrange, who was a convicted counterfeiter with a gift for art. And so he decorated the chapel for them. And his depictions of the Annunciation, the Nativity, the prodigal son, still adorn the chapel walls. Lagrange's work not only softened his sentence, but left a lasting, haunting mark on this tropical outpost of punishment. Now for something unrelated to the prison for a moment. These islands are now managed by France's space agency. And perched discreetly on Ile Royale, the Cine telescope is one of the island's most unexpected sights. You can't get right up inside to this facility, but it's fascinating to glimpse it from the barriers, especially when you know its high-tech purpose. So it's operated by the French space agency, CNES, and this dome-covered telescope and camera system tracks Ariane rocket launches from nearby Kourou. And since 1968, it's filmed every mission's early flight stages, including stage separations and any anomalies. It's equipped with 5 advanced cameras, 2 infrared, and it plays a vital role in France's space program. So it's an exciting reminder that even here, among old prison ruins, people still have their eyes on the stars. Now, from the northern tip of Ile Royale, the view across to Devil Island is both beautiful and unsettling. Now, it's perched on a rocky slope, and you'll see Captain Alfred Dreyfus's solitary hut. It's just visible through the trees. It's a small, pale structure against a dark volcanic rock, and then you've got the trees wrapping around it. And it was here, in near total isolation, that Dreyfus spent over 4 years wrongfully in prison, surrounded by sea and silence. And the narrow channel between the islands is deceptively calm, yet it is treacherous to cross. You stand at this lookout, most people will pause and are struck by this really stark contrast between what could be a tropical paradise, but the injustice that once unfolded just across the water. The solitary confinement cells remain among the most haunting sights on the island. Now, these narrow, airless spaces were reserved for prisoners deemed the most unruly or the most dangerous. With no beds, no light, only a slit in the wall for ventilation, inmates were left to endure days, even months, in crushing isolation. Food was passed through a hatch. Human contact was forbidden. The heat, silence, the psychological strain made this punishment as brutal as physical hardship. Today, you can peer inside, you can feel the oppressive weight of the punishment that was meant to break your spirit. And then you've got the other cells as well. The main cell block on Ile Royale is a stark reminder of this island's grim past. It was built to house hundreds of inmates along its corridors. So you can see the crumbling stone, the rusted iron bars that once echoed with the footprints of the guards, the silence of despair. Now, each tiny cell, which measures barely 2 meters wide, held a prisoner condemned to hard labor and isolation. And some of the walls still bear scratched messages or numbers, silent traces of the lives who were once confined within. Though what you can see here on the screen of my photo is 2011. So I would imagine some visitor has thought it's a nice idea to graffiti the year they visited, which I always find so sad when visiting places like this. So-and-so was here, 2011. By the way, in the main prison cell area, it's really horrible how it happened. The prisoners were chained, and they were chained to a metal bar that ran along the wall. They couldn't even move freely within their own cells. Absolutely cruel way of locking people up. I'm going to show you something very sad next. The Children's Cemetery on Ile Royale, one of the island's most poignant and unexpected sights. They're marked by small weathered crosses, and this holds the graves of children who lived and died on the island. Not prisoners, but the sons and daughters of prison staff. Guards and administrators often brought their families to this remote outpost, but tropical disease claimed many young lives. In contrast, prisoners and most adults were buried at sea, and that was a practice intended to discourage escape attempts because it would attract sharks to the waters around the islands. So this cemetery stands as a quiet reminder that even innocents suffered in this harsh place. But you look at the waters around and wonder why they're so shark infested. Well, that's the bodies of the inmates that ensured that state. Here they are on a map. And just whilst we've got this zoomed in map up, please be super careful when you get off the tender here. You're going to come up onto the mainland. You're going to turn left. Don't turn right, turn left. Follow it along. And then if you want to take the stairs are around here that lead up towards number 3. That's sort of halfway up the stairs area. If you want to take the path, this is the more gentle, sloping, but longer route, then you will follow this white line all the way around the edge. And this white line is climbing as you go. So it's an uphill, but fairly achievable because it's so long. And then you're going to come up in at the northern side of the top. You'll have the telescope there to your right, and then you'll come in through to the cell block. So you can either come the quicker journey up through the stairs, that brings you to the museum quicker, or you take the longer one, amazing, beautiful views, a lovely walk, bit hot, and you go past the Children's Cemetery and then in at the top. So let's get back to Alfred Dreyfus, formerly Captain Alfred Dreyfus. It's 1898, and Dreyfus is locked up in a small, stifling cabin on the treacherous Ile du Diable, Devil's Island. Sentenced to life, but at this rate, it's not going to be a very long life. Between the relentless heat, the malaria, the total isolation, the psychological toll, his chance of dying within the year is roughly 1 in 2. The odds were never in his favor. Remember, 70% of prisoners didn't survive this penal colony. But back in France, someone has taken up his cause. And not just anyone. Emile Zola, France's most famous writer, is about to put everything on the line, not because he knows Dreyfus, but because he knows what's right. By now, a small group of people, journalists, intellectuals, Dreyfus's brother Mathieu, they've been quietly gathering evidence and publishing articles. But it's not enough. The military brass is doubling down. The courts are closed off. The government wants this whole affair buried. And that's where Zola steps in. And he does it in the most public way possible. He writes an open letter to the President of France and titles it with two words that explode like a cannon across the Republic. J'accuse. I accuse. J'accuse is one of the most famous letters ever written in France. Yes, Marie Antoinette may or may not have written something about cake. But this letter, this one didn't just change Alfred Dreyfus's life. It shook the foundations of the French Republic. Emile Zola's open letter was published on the 13th of January 1898 on the front page of the newspaper Ile Royale in bold letters. It wasn't subtle. It named names, generals, judges, ministers, and it accused them one by one of conspiracy, incompetence, anti-Semitism, and the willful destruction of an innocent man's life. And Zola wasn't guessing. He laid out the facts, the contradictions, the forged documents, the army's deliberate cover-up. And within this letter, he wrote, "La vérité est en marche, et rien ne l'arrêtera." The truth is on the march, and nothing shall stop it. And that line became a rallying cry. Zola's aim was simple: force a new trial by creating a scandal so big the government couldn't ignore it. Though Zola was immediately put on trial for libel, convicted, and had to flee to England, he succeeded. The scandal triggered by J'accuse became impossible to contain. The public was now deeply divided. On the one side, you had Dreyfusards who believed in justice and true process. On the other side, you had anti-Dreyfusards who clung to the army's honor, and in many cases, openly embraced anti-Semitism. Under mounting pressure, the government agreed to reopen the case. In 1899, after 5 years of imprisonment on Devil's Island, Alfred Dreyfus was brought back to France. Was he free? No. He was brought home for a retrial at Rennes. But that retrial was anything but straightforward. Despite the mountain of evidence in his favor, exposed forged documents, biased judges, Esterhazy's guilt, the military court once again found Dreyfus guilty, this time with extenuating circumstances. It was an absurd verdict, and the backlash was immediate. Facing national embarrassment, the President of France, Emile Zola, issued a pardon allowing Dreyfus to go free, but not to be declared innocent. It was a compromise designed to calm the chaos. And Dreyfus, ever loyal, accepted it for the sake of peace, even though it meant his name was still tarnished. It took a further 7 years after that hollow pardon for the truth to finally catch up with the lies. And in 1906, after relentless campaigning by Dreyfus supporters and a slow but growing shift in public opinion, the French Court of Cassation, the country's highest court of appeal, finally officially exonerated Alfred Dreyfus. The guilty verdict was overturned, and his name was legally and publicly cleared. Dreyfus was reinstated into the army, and this time with a rank of major, and not just symbolically. He went on to serve France during World War I. He was wounded in action. That's how loyal he remained to a nation that had nearly destroyed him. He also received the Légion d'honneur, which is France's highest honor, though it was awarded pretty quietly, without fanfare. There was no grand apology, no national reckoning, just a quiet, belated correction. By then, the man who had changed the course of the case, Emile Zola, was already dead. He died of 1902 of carbon monoxide poisoning in what many believe was not an accident. 4 years later, when his remains were moved to the Pantheon, which is the most sacred tomb of France's greats, Dreyfus was there, paying tribute to the man who had risked everything for a stranger. 70% of prisoners sent to Devil's Island died before they could complete their sentence. 70% of bystanders stay silent when they witness an emergency or injustice when they believe that 4 or more other people were also present. There are about 600 of us in the room right now. Statistically, that means about 420 of us would do absolutely nothing. Auriez-vous le courage d'accuser? Would you have the courage to accuse?